Hello everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, and I am coming to you today from Northeast Portland, more particularly from along Fremont Street, Northeast Fremont, and I'm trying to get to the vicinity of 47th in Fremont, which is just 15 or so blocks this direction. I'm walking west on Fremont, and I have an intriguing, if nothing else, story to bring to you today. Something that might almost qualify as a Historic Murders of Portland episode, but I just felt like giving this thing its own video because it's just a case that's interesting to me. It was an intriguing mystery, at least officially, for a few days. And then suddenly the authorities found a resolution to what had happened. And it seems open and shut on the face of it, maybe. But I don't know. There's some strange things about this particular case that I'm going to bring to you. It was a very obscure thing. The first time I found this, there was just a little few sentence, almost like a little, small paragraph saying, oh, this happened, and that was all I found. I actually searched the newspaper resource that I usually use. I searched it for all over the place to try to find more about the story and didn't find anything. I came back about a year later, and there was like 5 or 6 articles about it, but that was really it. There was a few articles about it, and then some articles that supposedly resolved the matter, and I don't know. Maybe the resolution that was found is accurate, but I'm not so convinced. So join me as I bring to you an interesting death that occurred up here in Northeast Portland back in 1911. And I just crossed 57th and Fremont, and in doing so began encroaching on the massive Rose City Cemetery. So essentially, this cemetery goes just going east and west goes at least 10 blocks. Of course, 47th up here is a much more crowded intersection than I thought it would be. But back in 1911, I'm willing to guess pretty much all of this that is here today wasn't here. There was probably, a few homes. These are definitely newer homes, but, most of this other stuff is not more than 100 years old. So this probably was just park space, maybe connected to the cemetery. But whatever the case for these particular surroundings, however they looked back in 1911, at approximately 2:30 p.m. on March 28th, 1911, the body of a girl, believed to be possibly as young as 15, but more likely 16 to 17 years old, was discovered in some bushes. There's a little bit of bushes here. There's some bushes right behind me, but whatever bushes she was found in are likely, or at least the area that was taken up by bushes, are likely not taken up by that in this area anymore. she was discovered, her feet were sticking out of the bushes. She wasn't really concealed. She was just she looked like she had just flopped into the bushes. And it was immediately reported that she'd sustained severe blunt force trauma to her head. She had a lot of damage to her skull, which led, to a pretty quick and easy conclusion that someone had battered her to death, with some kind of blunt instrument and then tossed her into the brush. And it was believed, by the state of the body upon its discovery, it was figured she probably hadn't been here too long. She'd probably been deposited in the brush here the night before, which would have been a Monday evening. So the evening of March 27th, sometime, maybe even in the middle of the night, the body was deposited here. Likely, battered elsewhere, maybe battered somewhere near here, and then just dragged to a place where there were some bushes and dropped there. It didn't seem like much of an effort was made to hide the body. It was pretty easily found. Now, for the first 24 to 48 hours, it was a pretty easy to reach conclusion that this young woman had been, beaten. That was the presumption based on the state of her body. However, when she was taken to the medical examiner, the coroner's report also noted that amidst her battered skull, there was a gunshot wound in the side of her head. It was in the right temple. And that kind of changed things up. It seemed to make it like a much more graphic killing in this regard. And also the coroner also deemed, kind of in correlation with the police, that it was unlikely that at the time of her discovery that this young woman had been dead for more than 20 hours, which means the earliest she would have been killed would have been probably early evening the day before her body was discovered. And the girl was pretty well dressed. She had on a really nice plaid skirt. The newspapers made a point to note that she wasn't wearing a hat. There wasn't a hat discovered around her. It was very common for women when they went out to wear hats. That was just a very common thing. And authorities were pretty certain she was likely somebody who lived in the area. And I think they might have ascribed that to her nice look, because this was a fairly affluent area at the time. It's certainly not bad now, but at the time it was fairly affluent. So it was figured that she probably lived close by. Furthermore, her clothes weren't in a state of disarray, like she'd been struggling with something or somebody, which led authorities to believe even more so that she'd likely been killed somewhere else and ultimately placed in the bushes near this intersection. And it was something of a misnomer that was reported, that a construction worker was working the area, which is interesting. There's some construction work going on right up the street here. Apparently, this guy named J.P. O'Neill was given early credit for the discovery of the body, when in fact he was just the guy who reported it. But he wasn't the one who found the body, as was initially reported. There was actually another individual, and the newspapers never named this guy, which is interesting. He apparently he was this kind of strange guy that was kind of desperate for work, and he kept showing up at the construction site where O'Neill and his other, co-workers were doing work. It said doing street work nearby, so I can only assume they were doing street work along Fremont, with 47th being right back here. And yeah, O'Neill said that, this guy's showing up every other day looking for work, pestering us, bothering us. We didn't, they wouldn't give him work. I don't think they really liked him. I think they were kind of weirded out by the guy. This guy on March 25th was once again heading back to where these construction workers were working, because he was once again going to try to beg and plead for them to give him a job with them. And apparently he was on his way there. Now, they never say where the construction was going on, so I don't know if it was east of 47th or west. It doesn't stipulate that in any of the articles I read. But apparently this guy, again unnamed, was on his way back to talk to these construction guys about getting a job when he discovered the body of this woman in the bushes. And, you know, after seeing that, he ran to where the construction guys were. It wouldn't surprise me if even after telling him, oh, hey, by the way, I found a body. It looks like there's a girl that got beaten and shot to death back here in the bushes. But how about that job situation? You know? So O'Neill learned of it from this guy, and he called the authorities. And it was definitely a bewildering case to police because, you know, this woman was so well dressed. She looked, you know, very clean, very well educated, very affluent. And it was kind of, you know, the authorities thought she'd likely been lured to some location, probably in this area, you know, somewhere in the vicinity of Fremont and 47th, either by some guy that was desperate for her affections, that either felt she wouldn't want to be with him or had rejected him and he took out revenge. It could have been just some creeper that lured her somewhere and then killed her. That was kind of what the police were working with in the immediate aftermath of this case. And then finally, just a short while later, after this discovery of this body, a break in the case. Authorities come out and say that they have resolved the matter and that the victim that was discovered back here in the vicinity of 47th and Fremont was a young girl named Suzanne Queering. Her last name is spelled Q-U-I-R-I-N-G, so I think it's Queering or Curing, probably Queering. It was deemed that she had disappeared, and apparently right around the time she disappeared from her home, right around the time that this body was found along the cemetery, which this is technically cemetery land through here, but it's kind of just grass space. But this probably would have been more of the park element of it. But right around the time that this body was found, apparently Suzanne had been reprimanded at her school. I don't know if it was like she got detention or what exactly. And it was deemed that she was so ashamed by this that she took a gun that her uncle owned. Apparently, you know, in the aftermath of her disappearing, his gun went missing too. And that Suzanne Queering took his gun and went to the vicinity of 47th and Fremont and shot herself dead. So it was a suicide, was the ultimate resolution. And that was the resolution that held. That was, you know, so you think open and shut case. Like you think, okay, this guy, you know, probably would identify the body as Suzanne. Like they would, you know, it's not like they're just like, oh, well, this girl's probably this girl. Like they would actually like, you know, positively identify her. So open and shut case, right? Well, I don't know. Part of my issue is the police at the time. You know, you can say police at any given period of time are corrupt, but let me just say, during this time, the early 20th century, you know, I'm not talking about any other period of time, just that period of time, you know, to era around 1911. Very, very corrupt police force that would, if there was a case that needed to get solved, they would find a way to solve it. And this was definitely one. This was a little girl found dead and nobody knew what had happened at first. Like, they knew she was dead and it was likely a murder, and then suddenly it's a suicide. So you'd think, okay, she did have a gunshot wound and it was to the temple. That's, you know, possibly someone who's going to commit suicide would do it that way. This, you know, the uncle's probably identified her, so you should be open and shut. Why am I even talking about it anymore? Well, I have little doubt that Suzanne Queering disappeared or died in some way, probably as well. But I'm not 100% convinced she's not the victim, but I am not at all convinced that she is the victim. And therein lies the lingering mystery of this case that got 5 or 6 articles in a newspaper back in 1911 before fading away, a case probably most people don't even know about. I wouldn't even know about if I didn't accidentally stumble onto it. As I continue walking down, or I guess walking up Northeast 47th, let me just express what bothers me about this situation, about the idea that this Suzanne Quiring was this victim that was found dead. First things first, after it was suddenly reported that Suzanne was the victim, all of a sudden there's reports in the newspapers that there was a gun found next to the body. But in every article before her identification as a victim, not one reference to a gun being found in the area. You know, the police even discussed, like, she had a, there was no acknowledgement that there was a gunshot wound involved until she went to the coroner, or her body was seen by the coroner, and he said, oh, amidst the battering, this happened as well. So it was like, almost 48 hours before anybody even acknowledged a gunshot wound had taken place, and yet this is apparently the only thing that happened. This girl walked to the spot and shot herself dead. But then, there was all these reports that she was found with her skull, bashed in. It was, again, before the coroner came out with his conclusion, they said it was abundantly clear that she'd been beaten to death by a blunt instrument. Her death was likely blunt force trauma to her fractured skull. Well, that doesn't go with this story that a girl just walked to a spot and shot herself. Where did all this extra damage to her head come from? Next on the list, every report those first few days, they stated exactly where the body was found. In some bushes at Northeast 47th and Fremont. That was a done deal. That was expressed and repeated in numerous sources by numerous witnesses. And when Suzanne Quiring suddenly came into the matter, they said that she was found at Northeast 37th and Knott Street. For the record, 47th of Fremont, 37th and Knott, those are about a mile apart. They're not even close. This isn't like, oh, I thought it happened 2 blocks that way, but it really happened right here. There was no reports of Suzanne Quiring's body being found near 47th and Fremont, near Rose City Cemetery. They said she was found near 37th and Knott. So she's applied to this girl that's found dead, but the locations are completely different, and that was never changed. They never fixed one and said, oh, well, no, the girl in the brush was actually found at 37th and Knott, or, oh, no, Suzanne Quiring was actually found near 47th and Fremont. They never rectified that. And another issue was her uncle, Suzanne's uncle. His gun had gone missing, so that was explained to a degree. Again, how do all these witnesses not see a gun in the vicinity? And he didn't have an explanation for how she got the bullets. He said that there weren't any bullets in the house. So she could have, maybe found his gun, but where'd she get the bullets from? And that the answer to that question was left to mystery. And this is another thing, in addition to the gun, never reported until Suzanne Quiring comes into the matter. Apparently, she was found with 2 more bullets in her possession. Specifically, these 2 bullets that Suzanne was found with, meaning she had somehow gotten her hands on at least 3, were wrapped in a handkerchief that I guess was in a pocket of her dress. Again, no mention of this in any reports on the case before Suzanne Quiring suddenly became the victim. Apparently the gun's sitting right there to be found, bullets are found on her, and yet none of this information is expressed. The newspapers even said when the coroner found the gunshot wound to the girl's head, they still said maybe that's a sign of a suicide, but they all still were thinking murder. it's bizarre that all these things just suddenly showed up at the right time to make everything fall into place. And yet, is there a paper trail? Is there an explanation for how these things were apparently not there when the crime scene is discovered? And, it takes days for this stuff to suddenly show up. And here's another thing. If Suzanne Queering is the victim, she disappears the day before the body is discovered. She disappears March 27th, 1911. So logistically, you'd think, and again, even the police and the coroner said this body had likely been left there sometime late in the evening, March 27th, to maybe the early morning hours of March 28th. And so in Suzanne Quering's case, she probably would have gone there at least early evening, shot herself dead. She, falls dead in the brush. Not one neighbor not one person living in that area heard any gunshots anywhere around, this time before the discovery of the body. And mind you, this area was a lot more sparsely populated then, a lot fewer houses, buildings, fences, trees to deflect the sound of a gunshot. Nobody in this area heard a gunshot. Now, if this was a murder victim who was killed elsewhere and then her body is deposited there, those facts line up. But if it's somebody going to that certain spot and shooting herself dead, why does nobody hear it? And beyond that, what I'm wondering is, she would have had to have ended up in the place where she was found several hours, at least 12 hours before she was officially found. Now, back in 1911, again, less population, everything spread out a little bit more, but Fremont was still a fairly busy stretch, as it is today. It boggles my mind that, this body was found modestly hidden. And it took till 2:30 in the afternoon before a guy who's got tunnel vision, focused on trying to get a job, he just suddenly stumbles onto it. That bothers me. It seems unlikely that nobody else in the morning, a couple hours into the afternoon before then, nobody else saw this except this one guy. And this one guy who, again, is nameless, and by the accounts of the construction workers he talked to, was kind of an oddball. And he ends up finding the body out of nowhere. That's interesting to me. I'm very suspicious about this unnamed guy desperate for a construction job, and I wish I could know more about his background, but I can't even find the guy's name in any article, so he's just a guy lost as a mystery. But of course, if you have guys you're suspicious about in a murder case, again, Suzanne Queering doesn't fit into that. So what do you think happened? You think I'm out of my mind? Or is it possible that this may be a kind of crazy, bizarre cover-up? And that one girl went missing at conveniently the right time, so the police just tied two and two together so they wouldn't get stuck with a murder mystery of a young girl that they knew local Portlanders wouldn't tolerate that case not getting solved, and it would look horrible on them. Police have an extensive history of, especially at that time in this city, of covering up things however they had to. Me personally, I think it was some kind of setup. It was some kind of cover-up. I've read about plenty of things along those lines that happened in the city of Portland back there close to the turn of the century. So this would not be, get some bugs on me, that would not be out of the norm at all for Portland's police force, and Portland's police force specifically at that time, to need to resolve a case that they immediately realized we got nothing. And put this one with that one and say, there we go, we figured it out. It's a tragedy, but it's resolved, so we don't have to talk about it anymore. And, after Suzanne Queering was reported as having committed suicide over being reprimanded at her school, which seems like a pretty far stretch I know kids have sometimes gotten pushed to their limits with their education and they kind of go a little crazy, but getting one reprimand at school, I don't even think she got like suspended or anything. Just one reprimand at school and you decided you needed to die. Does that sound plausible to you, even for a 12-year-old? Again, I don't quite buy it, but maybe you do. Anyway, let me know what you think. And thank you so much for watching this bizarre mystery that I uncovered randomly looking for other things, which is often how I find some of my best stuff. So remember, guys, as always, to like, share, subscribe. Hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out that way. And, ooh, it's an old gas tank for, like, your heater in your house. At least that's what I think it is. Anyway, Steve the Amateur Restorer, and I'll see you guys next time.